Let's talk about fabric covering and finishing on an aircraft. When you're trying to decide what is the correct weight of textile fabric that you're going to be using in covering any kind of aircraft, there's two factors that you have to take a look at. And those two factors are the speed of the aircraft and also the maximum wing loading. Speed of aircraft and maximum wing loading will tell you what weight of textile fabric you need to select. Now, the strength classification of the fabrics used in aircraft covering are based on tensile strength. And fabric needs to be tested at regular intervals to determine if the fabric has sufficient strength to still assure the aircraft can be operated safely. Now, suppose that you're given this example. You're testing the strength of grade A fabric, and grade A fabric, by the way, has a tensile strength of 80 pounds per square inch new. You're testing the strength of grade A cotton fabric. It was used on an aircraft that did not require grade A cotton fabric. It only required intermediate grade fabric, which has, by the way, an original strength of 65 pounds per square inch. The issue is, what is the minimum acceptable strength of the fabric when you're testing it? What they're basically asking you is, what percent of the original strength do you have to have, and does it have to be of the grade A fabric you covered it in, or of the intermediate grade fabric, which is all that that particular aircraft requires? Well, first of all, what you're looking for is 70% of the original strength of the fabric, and it only has to be 70% of the strength of the fabric required on the aircraft, not of what you actually used. So if the aircraft only requires intermediate grade fabric, and you use grade A, you still only need 70% of the original strength of the intermediate fabric, not 70% of the strength of the grade A fabric. Let's talk now about seams. Machine-sewn seams in aircraft covering fabrics can be folded fell or French fell types. The top figure here is a folded fell type seam. Fell means that the fabric is doubled over on itself for each particular element of the fabric. But notice that these two pieces of fabric that are being joined together by the seams do not overlap inside each other. They butt up here in the middle. So here is the folded fell seam. It's got basically three fabric thicknesses. Here's the top layer doubled over. Here's the doubled over part of the bottom layer, and then there's the bottom layer. And they're not actually inside each other. A French fell seam, on the other hand, the fabrics are actually tucked inside each other before they're sewn. So with a French fell seam, you actually have four fabric thicknesses. Here is the top one, here's two, here's three, and here's four. And the top one is folded over and then kind of tucked inside of the other one. So if they ask you on the test, what type of seam has four fabric thicknesses, it's going to be the French fell seam. They'll also be asking you about a plain lapped seam and whether or not a plain lapped seam can ever be used. It can be used. It is allowed, provided you've got selvage edges or pinked edges that you're going to be joining. Selvaged edges are woven edges. Pinked edges are cut in a series of V's, and the purpose of doing that is it keeps the material from unraveling. With a plain lapped seam, the pieces of fabric are simply laid one on top of the other and then they're sewn, and you can do that provided the ends are not going to come unraveled. They're either selvaged edges, meaning woven, or pinked edges, meaning cut in a series of V's. Now, the purpose of applying surface tape or finishing tape on a fabric-covered aircraft is to prevent wear. And the places you're trying to prevent wear is over lacings and seams and corners and edges. So finishing tape is used to provide additional wear resistance over the edges of fabric-forming structures. Now, the FAA might ask you if finishing tape is used to provide additional anti-tear resistance under reinforcement tape. And no, that's not how it's used. Reinforcing tape is used under the fabric covering in places such as over the ribs between the lacing cord and the fabric covering to prevent the cord from cutting or wearing through the fabric. Finishing tape is applied over the fabric covering to provide additional wear resistance over the edges of fabric forming structures. And by the way, finishing tape has nothing to do with preventing ripple formation. When you're applying that finishing tape on a fabric-covered aircraft, what you want to do is dope it on after the first or second coat of dope. Now, before you apply surface tape to the trailing edge of the wing or control surface, you want to notch that tape at intervals along it. The purpose of that is to prevent the entire seam from loosening in the event the tape begins to separate from the surface in any one spot. What the notches do is that if the tape does start to loosen and come up, it will tear at the notches instead of taking the whole tape off from that edge. Let's talk about dope proofing the aircraft structure. You need to dope proof the parts of the aircraft structure that come in contact with doped fabric. What are acceptable protective coatings? Aluminum foil and cellulose tape are two acceptable protective coatings to dope proof the aircraft structure. Now, acetone. What you should use acetone for is simply to remove grease from fabric. You do not want to use acetone as a thinner, simply to remove grease from the fabric. Now, the first coat that you want to put on will be a fungicidal dope. Fungicidal dopes are used in aircraft finishing as the first coat, and the purpose of that is to prevent fabric rotting. That's why they're applied extremely thin, because the whole idea is that you want to completely saturate the fabric in order to keep the fabric from rotting. Aluminum pigment or aluminum paste is used to exclude sunlight from the fabric. It is not used to get a pretty color or to keep moisture out. It is used to exclude sunlight from the fabric because ultraviolet light will rot the fabric, and the aluminum pigment added to the dope will keep the ultraviolet light from getting to the fabric. Now, when you're finishing a fabric surface, you need to apply at least the number of coats necessary to result in a taut and well-filled finished job. There's a real problem if you try to apply too much material in one coat, because too much material applied in one coat will give a coat that tends to look like this. What you're going to have is runs and you're going to have sags. That comes from too much material put on at one time. It is not a good idea to dope fabric if it's a very humid day, because what that will do is increase the tendency of the dope to blush. This is blush right here. Blushing gives a thick kind of milky white appearance to the finish like this, and it occurs because the cellulose nitrate or the cellulose acetate precipitates out of solution. Blushing is a defect in aircraft finishes. It's not very attractive. You don't want it. And the things that cause blushing are moisture in the air supply line, adverse meaning high humidity, drafts, or sudden changes in temperature. Now, what's one way to kind of help cope with that? Retarder. Retarder is a slow-drying solvent, and retarder is added to some finishes, and the purpose of it is to slow down the drying time, and that helps to prevent blush. Now, if the dope is getting old and beginning to crack, you can use what is called fabric rejuvenator, which is really kind of a misnomer, because what you're really rejuvenating is the dope rather than the fabric. It restores the condition of dope coatings. If the dope is hardened and begun to crack, The solvents and the plasticizers in that rejuvenator penetrate the dope and restore the flexibility. You've got to be careful, however, and make sure that the underlying fabric still meets the strength requirements. Now let's assume that you're sanding an aircraft fabric covered surface. One of the things that you need to do is you need to make sure that you have electrically grounded the structure, and the purpose of that is to prevent static electricity buildup. Especially if the first coats of finish were nitrate dope, static electricity buildup from the sanding can cause a spark to jump inside the structure and ignite the fumes, which would be a very unhappy thing. Now there's various types of patches that you might be called on to make. Let's talk about how you would repair it if you had an L-shaped tear and each leg of that tear was approximately 14 inches long. With an L-shaped tear like that, the stitch you want to use is a baseball stitch. And where you want to sew from is from the center of the tear and go out towards the extremity of each leg. So use a baseball stitch, start in the center of the tear, go out to the extremity of each leg, and then you would dope on a patch over that. If you're going to be spraying any finishing materials on unpainted, cleaned aluminum, you want to be very careful to avoid touching the surface with your bare hands. You want to wear gloves or something like this woman is. And the reason for that is the oils and acids on the skin will cause poor paint adhesion. Wash primers are designed to make a good bond between the metal surface and the finish, and they allow a top coat to be applied within about half an hour. Now, some wash primers include phosphoric acid. The phosphoric acid treats the metal, which gives better adhesion, and it also protects that metal from corrosion. The most critical aspect when you're applying wash primers is to make sure there's enough moisture in the air, that the humidity is high enough, because you need moisture in the air in order to convert the acid into the phosphate film to protect the metal. So let's assume that you're applying unhydrated wash primer, meaning wash primer with no water added to it. You're applying it to unpainted aluminum, and you're going to put a finish top coat on in about 30 to 40 minutes. You're doing this all in low humidity conditions. What is the likely result that you're going to get? The likely result is you're going to get corrosion. And the reason that you get corrosion is because of that low humidity. The low humidity does not allow proper conversion of the acid to the phosphate film, and what ends up happening is you trap active acid against the metal, and what is that going to give you? It gives you corrosion. Let's assume, on the other hand, that you have hydrated wash primer, meaning you've added water to the primer. You're applying it to unpainted aluminum. Again, you have low humidity, and again, you're going to follow it in about 30 to 40 minutes with a finished top coat. What kind of result will you get now? A good result. What you're going to get is a glossy, blush-free finish, and the reason for that is, even though you have low humidity, you have hydrated the wash primer. You have done it by adding some water to the thinner when you made up the primer. Now, if you have old wash primer coats, they may be overcoated directly with epoxy finishes. If you have a question about compatibility, old wash primer coats can be overcoated directly with an epoxy finish. Now, the most durable and chemical resistant top coat is a properly applied finish of polyurethane. Polyurethane will even protect agricultural aircraft and seaplanes, and they live in a pretty rough environment. If you have applied masking tape to an aircraft, like when you're trim spraying, and you leave it on for several days and or expose it to heat, it's a real hot day, it is quite likely that that tape will cure to the finish and be very difficult to remove. Let's talk about the registration numbers on an aircraft. The letters and numbers on the identification markings on an aircraft have to be of a contrasting color to the background that they're painted on. They have to be a uniform shape and size, and the regulations say that the width of the characters has to be 2/3 of the height of the characters. And there's some other rules about the spacing on it. Let's assume that you're going to put 12-inch registration numbers on an aircraft. The registration mark is November 1683 Charlie. And the issue is, what is the minimum space required? In other words, how many inches along the fuselage are you going to have to allow for that registration mark? And they also tell you in the question some of the stuff from the regulation that otherwise you would simply go and look up. And the other information that they tell you is that the character width has to be 2/3 of the height, that the width for the 1 has to be 1/6 of the height, that the spacing between the characters, it has to be 1/4 of the character width, which basically boils down, since the character width is 2/3 of the height, that it has to be 1/4 of 2/3 of the height, and that the stroke or line width has to be 1/6 of the height. Well, the stroke or the line width is regulatorily required, but it doesn't have anything to do with how many inches across the fuselage that registration mark is going to take up. So let's work our way through that. Let's start first of all with the characters themselves. November 1683 Charlie. Okay, the character width has to be 2/3 of the height, and the height is going to be 12 inches. We already know that. So 2/3 of 12 is 8. The end will take 8 inches. We'll work the characters first, and then we'll come back to the spacing. They said that the 1 has to be 1/6 of the height. We're going for 12-inch letters. 1/6 of 12 is 2 inches for the width on the 1. The other characters, the numbers, like the N, have to be 2/3 of the height, and so 2/3 of 12 is 8 inches. The 6, 8, 3, and the letter C all are going to be 8 inches. Now, how about the spacing between them? The spacing has to be 1/4 of the character width. The character width is 2/3 of the height. 2/3 of 12 is 8, and for the spacing we need 1/4 of that. 1/4 of 8 is 2, and we have 5 spaces. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces between those different letters and numbers. 5 times 2 is 10 inches, and when we total all of those up, we come up that we're going to need a number of inches along the fuselage of 52 inches in order to put that registration mark on it. The line width is not relevant to the space required on the fuselage. Let's talk now about cabin upholstery. Cabin upholstery materials that are installed in current standard category airplanes have to be at least flame resistant according to FAR Part 23. Not another part, but Part 23, and it has to be flame resistant. It does not have to be fireproof. And that covers what you need to know about fabric covering and finishes.